Thank you all for being here and for your patience. I would like to thank the organizers for accepting our paper presentation, and of course our host for their great hospitality. My co-author Emilia Thanasiou was not able to come to join us here today, but she's following from YouTube, I think. Sorry, from Zoom. Our paper discusses the twofold role that international film productions have played in the development of Greece's tourism in the 1950s, both as an exportable commodity for international consumption and as a national cultural asset, an instrument for the construction of a new national image in the context of Europe's post-war recovery. International film productions and co-productions shot in Greece from 1950 to 1965, 33 in total, played a decisive role in the construction of this image. This can be grouped in two categories. The first involves historical period and war dramas, and the second, romantic comedies and adventures. In the second group on which our research focuses, the action is set in contemporary Greece and deals with summer holidays or with the antiquities, site excavations, and smuggling, where, among other sub-themes, the relationship of the locals with the ancient monuments, especially in rural Greece, is being problematized through Western eyes. In the films of the period, the antiquities function as a strong connective tissue, a uniform backdrop, and a recurring motif for the cinematic action, thus constructing idealized filmic loci, where the historical past and the present merge into an uninterrupted continuum, devoid of breaks and ambiguities. Accordingly, what is often recorded on the screen is the awkward transition of a centuries-old unpretentious coexistence between the ancient monuments and local communities, interrupted by the state-run states management of the antiquity by the Greek National Tourism Organization, GNTO in short, that aimed at exploiting the nascent tourist, exploiting the antiquities for the nascent tourist industry. As this paper suggests, the above are encapsulated ideally in Jean Negulescu's Boy on a Dolphin from 1957. 20th Century Fox production is based on a 1955 novel by David Devine. A key role in its realization was played by the Greek-American Spiros Kouras, president of the company since 1942, whom the Americans wanted to involve in Greece's reconstruction program. Skouras' resolve to finance a costly production in Greece may have been precipitated by the development of the CinemaScope technology. This new feature, best suited for epic scenes and natural locations, was first tried out in Negulescu's Three Coins in the Fountain, shot on location in Italy and discussed yesterday by Paolo. This project launched a series of international productions by 20th Century Fox that sought to capitalize on the Americans' fascination with romantic and idyllic representations of distant and unexplored places in the context of easily digestible cinematic narratives. The plot of Boy of a Dolphin is fairly straightforward. Fedra, played by Lauren, and Reef, her Albanian boyfriend, played by Mistral, are sponge divers who stumble upon the Boy on a Dolphin, a Roman brass and gold figurehead, off the coast of Hydra. The film follows Fedra as he wavers between the nationally conscientious decision of handing over the statue to the authorities and the attractive bit of Victor Parmalee, played by Webb, as an antiquities collector whose money would secure a proper education for Fedra's younger brother. Disappointingly for 20th century folks, the film did not meet the success of Three Coins in the Fountain. It received mediocre reviews, while the scarce praise was mainly about Loren and Krasner's stunning cinematography of the Greek landscape. A Times critic commented that the colors of Technicolor Deluxe and CinemaScope technology were uniquely combined to render magnificent images of the Greek landscape on the screen. An earlier Times article pointed out that the film's intention was to brand Greece as a popular tourist destination in the same way that the Three Coins in the Fountain had showcased Rome. In any event, Boyon Adolphin's gaze upon contemporary Greece consciously constructs a potent cinematic image of the country that only until then Kounduros in The Ogre of Athens had tackled with certain efficiency. Transcribed into moving images, these principles also reflected the basic ingredients of Greece's tourism policy, filtered through an American outlook set in place already from the first post-World War II years of the Marshall Plan, something that Koundouros's film didn't do. Boyon Adolphin was shot in Greece between September and October 1956, with additional interior and underwater filming in the Cinecittà studios in the same year. The film consists of an introduction and 36 scenes, of which 5 were shot in Athens, 1 at the ancient theater of Epidaurus, 1 in a Meteora monastery, and the remaining 29 were shot in different parts of Hydra. The introduction is a tourist postcard featuring views of the Aegean Islands that bears no connection to the story that unfolds on the screen. With the exception of the scenes in Epidaurus and Meteora, which are not organically integrated into the plot, the rest of the film dialectically juxtaposes 2 filming locations: the urban landscape of Athens and the insular landscape of Hydra. In the history of cinema, the city-countryside binary is symbolically charged and carries connotations whereby the city is identified with the indulgences of modern life and the passions that erode social morals, while the countryside with the non-rational, unsophisticated, and often unpretentious character of its inhabitants. Here, the city is vested with an additional layer. It is the bearer of an omnipresent and compelling modernization. Fedra gets to meet both the hero and the villain of the film in 1950s Athens. Alas, the modern city is curiously subtle, often occupying the margins of the shots or their distant background. Instead, the action cuts straight to the Acropolis. After some fleeting use of the Stoa of Attalus, the ancient agora, and the Odeon of Herod Atticus. The scenes shot in the Cinecittà studios, posing as the interior of the old Acropolis Museum, celebrates a unique occasion. A few weeks earlier, the first 3 galleries of the museum had opened to the public after undergoing a thorough refurbishment. However, the scenario implies that the museum functioned as the headquarters of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, a misrepresentation that upset many Greek film critics. Apparently, the focus on the activities of the American archaeologists was not without purpose, as the intention was to promote the excavation and restoration work of the American school at the ancient agora, spearheaded by the recently reconstructed Stoa of Attalus that briefly appeared on the screen earlier. After the Acropolis, where the modern museum is portrayed as the protective cell of the ancient heritage, the action moves to Asteras in Glyfada, one of the first large-scale private investments in tourist infrastructure in Attica, where a luxurious modern architectural folly frames ideally Greece's modernization. The project became synonymous with the hedonism of modern overindulgence along the Athenian waterfront, thus inaugurating its rapid colonization by domestic and international tourists. This part of the movie paints a dynamic cinematic picture of Athens, where the onrushing post-war modernity, reverberating in the city's up-to-date tourist infrastructure, appears to spring from the glorious ruins of classical antiquity as if in a natural way. Modernism is the natural response of Greece's classical tradition, in other words. The landscape of Hydra counterpoints the Athenian drive for modernization. The island's rough, unspoiled terrain emits an ambience of picturesque backwardness and whimsical resistance to progress. The suits on the rocky shores of the island heighten the sense of, wild, remote isolation, although Hydra was marketed as a tourist destination at least by 1949 on the occasion of the first nautical festival organized by the Greek Touring Club. However, the traditional settlement of Hydra is treated cinematically as a two-dimensional real-size film set with the protagonists and the camera often moving along the quayside and almost never towards the labyrinthine interior of the settlement. The result is reminiscent of a typical Western movie where cinematic action and therefore cinematic space is limited to the main street of the settlement. Boy and a Dolphin was shot in Hydra, but was not really about Hydra. Only two scenes incorporate what could be described as aspects of everyday life on the island. These are two night suits at the Wave, a film set that recreated the atmosphere of an outdoor seaside tavern with live music and dancing. However, critics pointed out that the scenes echoed the folklore shows of the wine festival organized every September by the Touring Club in Attica and other parts of Greece as well, rather than the real experience of a living rural community. Nevertheless, this colorful make-believe local festival makes a crucial contribution to the rhetorical argument of the movie, since alongside Hydra's natural landscapes, it introduces an additional cultural layer, Greece's rich anthropogeography, where feasting is held in high regard. Indeed, it was a performative rhetoric addressed to an international audience of potential visitors, promising pleasure and carelessness. Elsewhere in the press, it was noted that the vitality of the Greeks is attractively portrayed through their dance, thus rendering the festival as a vehicle for the promotion of Greek valor, a stereotypical representation of the nation in cinema, in both international and domestic productions, and we saw some of these productions yesterday. Painting an image of Greece as a place of frivolity constitutes what could be described as an affirmative stereotype. The counter-argument claims that the cinematic representation of the Greek feast serves as an easily recognizable connotative signifier by the Greek working class. As Papadimitriou states, it is a Romaic vision, a Romaic vision of contemporary Greece and Greekness, and not necessarily a folkloric element. In this context, the performative function of the movie, a call to arms for all classes to partake in the country's modernizing future, also invites domestic audiences to reflect upon aspects of national identity, originality, and uniqueness, always in relation to these stereotypes that are put forward by the GNTO's campaign of the time. Interestingly, in Boy on a Dolphin, the leading role was assigned to an Italian, as Lawrence's Neapolitan features matched the roughness of the terrain. However, Italian critics did not take kindly to the image of their national star alongside aging Hollywood stars just for the sake of infusing Mediterranean sex appeal into the movie, and went as far as to describe and went as far as to claim that the project was a blatant attempt at cultural misappropriation. Lauren was being Americanized. Greek critic Marios Ploritis added to that that the film, in a way, depicts Greece's other colonization, where the country becomes a film colony, where blocked funds would be wasted unless used on the spot. In the early 1950s, tourism infrastructure in Hydra was non-existent. In a 1955 memorandum to Prime Minister Papagos, Hydra residents protest about the absence of hospitality infrastructure, which demonstrates that only a decade after World War II, rural communities saw the growth of tourism as one of the few ways to escape poverty. The first plans for the post-war tourist development of Hydra were drawn up in 1954, approximately, with the conversion of the Boudouris mansion, traditional mansion, into a guest house. 1957 saw the conversion of another mansion into a guest house, the Leusis mansion, despite the growing hesitance of the local community, who were skeptical towards the development of mass tourism on their island. Perhaps this is why the construction of a new hotel, a new modern hotel in Hydra, was delayed at least until 1957, when the international interest generated by the screening of Boy on a Dolphin tipped the balance. In the very same year, officials from the GNTO disembarked on the island to scout for appropriate plot. Locations that featured prominently in the movie were ruled out without second thought, as implanting a modern hotel on the premises, and I quote here from the minutes of the board of the directors, would offend both the view and the sensibilities of the locals, end of quote. After deliberation, the project was finally abandoned. Philippos Vokos's modern leisure infrastructure of 1962 for the organized beats at the formerly remote Mandraki Bay breaks momentarily with the island's elitist approach to tourism development that still holds true even today. This shows that tourism as a national priority and a vehicle for societal transformation has not always been a field of social consensus. Occasionally, the American-inspired policies by the GNTO caused friction with local communities, which remained unmoved or unconvinced, or both, by the state's modernizing vision, firmly defending their status quo against both well or ill-intentioned reconstruction plans. The prospect of Hydra's rapid and intensive tourist development was also not welcomed by a growing community of cultured foreigners who cherished the island's quiet isolation and charming primitiveness. This community emerged alongside the indigenous intellectual and artistic community that had been forming since the interwar period. Archaeologist Ioannis Papadimitriou, who served on GNTO's board, stressed that Hydra mainly attracted painters, actors, artists, and architects who do not like crowds, implying that modern hotels that were absent in 1956, implying modern hotels that were absent in 1956 when the island was overrun by members of the film crew. At the time, alternative means were mobilized. For example, Latsis Neraida passenger vessel featured prominently in the movie as Parmalay's yacht and doubled as the actors' sleeping quarters. The rest of the crew is reportedly staying on a board on ship herms, while Lauren and her large entourage lodged in a Hydra mansion. However, with the end of the shoots and the departure of the crew, Hollywood's spotlights went out, leaving the island, where electricity had not yet arrived, in the grip of a peculiar primitivism flirting with an emerging cosmopolitanism. In this dynamic context, the binary opposition between Greece's past and her modern future nourished the manifold reconstructions of the Greek summer on the silver screen and its ensuing cashing in on tourism growth. Not as a state of peaceful coexistence or as a seamless transition, but as if in an ideological tug of war, whose agility, whose agitation informs the various cinematic narratives and, of course, the realities of Greece of the times. Narrative cinema shaped the conditions for the development of tourism in Greece through the filmic reconstruction of a pure, simple, and primordial cultural landscape immersed in the bright light of the Aegean Sea. This was forged in a thoroughly traditional environment with strong folkloric elements, which is perceived here as the dialectical equivalent of the country's drive for modernization. The representation of modernity in cinema would be incomplete and ineffective as a propagandistic instrument without the presence of tradition in an unsophisticated narrative, such as the narrative of Boy and a Dolphin. Romantic adventures or comedies, often regarded as second-class genres, proved to be extremely effective in constructing a legible national image, which was not the case with other films like A Girl in Black, also discussed yesterday, which was shot in Hydra, but it's not did not help with the tourism in Hydra. Regardless of its aesthetic claims, the genre faithfully served Greece's national effort to promote a unique and recognizable identity, both for international and domestic audiences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you for this great presentation. And we can open the discussion to the audience and see if we have any questions before we move to the next one. It's working. Okay. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. I wanted to ask, one of the things that struck me also thinking about yesterday is to which degree can we also look at this not just as a history of the construction of the Greek specific sites, but also of a Mediterranean continuity that's being both reflected and constructed, in this case via Hollywood. I was thinking both in terms of, as you pointed, choosing this production, choosing to make Boy and a Dolphin after this immediately following the success of Three Coins on a Fountain. So kind of like thinking it as a logical progression of the same kind of project, bringing in an Italian actress to play a Greek character. 10 years later, the kind of spy films I was looking at, Melina Mercury would end up playing a Portuguese. So you also have like this circulation of character types, and to which degree is there also here like a parallel transnational history of continuity?
Okay, thanks. Well, that's an excellent question. Excellent, really. And thank you very much for making this comment. It is true that this presentation is a continuation of things that we began discussing yesterday. And of course, the thing that is quite striking when you read especially the press of the times, both the press film critics and also the general press, is the focus on national identity, not really what makes us all part of a culture, a shared culture around the Mediterranean, but what makes us unique compared to the other cultures, and all the concern is focused there. So yes, the presence of an Italian actress was not taken in very warmly. The presence of the Americans, who are omnipresent, and they are the sole representatives of the Greek state in this movie, it was also not taken very warmly. So it was always about, in the press of the times, it was always about how the unique Greekness has been, in a way, subjected to generalizations that made it look picturesque on the screen, and but not quite what the people were feeling about themselves. That's why we mention in the paper that most of these films, not only Boy and a Dolphin, it is an open process, an open question to the audiences, to ask them to reflect about the way the Greek audiences, to reflect about the way they think about themselves when they see Greekness portrayed on the screen. So to return to your original question, no, I don't think there was any discussion at the time, to my knowledge, of a shared cultural identity. More or less, yes, that's it.
Thank you. No, it was just a continuation on this comment, because I think there is really also in this case, it's clear the sort of gap that there was between the Hollywood industry and European audiences, because Hollywood didn't really get European audiences. They didn't get that they had to target more specifically on national traditions and contexts, and instead they considered European audiences as something homogeneous, creating a Mediterranean culture. And so it's no problem for them to exchange Greek actresses for Italian actresses and Spanish actresses and French actresses. And the role of stars, I think it's really interesting in this sense to see who is playing who in these films. And Sophia Loren in Boy on a Dolphin is really a great example of this absolutely exchangeable role of stars, because they're just all Europeans. And Audrey Hepburn was chosen in Roman Holidays because she was not Mediterranean. So not because she was not Italian or Greek or French, but she doesn't look like a Southern European. And this is William Wyler, who decided on her because she is not like this sort of actress. So I think this in the presentation was really clear that there was this really this gap that this homogenizing dynamics that Hollywood always implies, and then instead the reception was very varied in the different contexts, because of course it was an internal eye and not an external eye as Hollywood. So it's more of a comment than a real question, but I was just following up on this. Thank you.
But you're absolutely right. But Hollywood was very clever with that, with this attack of friendliness and PR relations, because they made absolutely certain that there were local actors and actresses involved, not as leading roles. So we see in other movies many Greek, well-known Greek actors starring, and this is what we call, it's in the longer version of the paper, what we call couleur locale. So there was this need of adding spices of the local culture with, I think is Minotis in this film, with almost a silent role. He's an official of the police, who is discreetly following the story that unfolds on the screen without intervening too much. And also this brings connotations about not very nice connotations about the police at the time, but that's a different thing. But yes, Hollywood was very clever. They always involved local actresses and actors, not necessarily in the leading roles, as I said before, but they had to be there to get something of the flavor of the local community into this Hollywood production and make it more topical and make it more localizable in a way.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 1, 2. It was a very fascinating presentation. I want just a short extension on this discussion, and I wonder if you could speak more to Marios Ploritis' comment on Greece as a film colony, because also it extends this kind of discussion of Mediterranean as one space. That, you know, does that refer to the times kind of anti-Americanism, Coca-Colization, and all of that. So that's one thing. And I'm very interested, and if you have the time to discuss as a separate question, about your methodological approach or your approach, because I'm very aware it's also discipline focused. So I was wondering, how do you see the film within this context of the urban and the rural or the island as such? So if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the first one, Marius Ploritis, I think there is a piece of the discussion missing from our presentation, which is the legal framework that the government created in order to facilitate the influx of Hollywood, foreign, but mainly Hollywood productions in Greece. It was a very interesting framework, which made it extremely appealing for foreigners, especially when coming from the States, to come to Greece and shoot their films there. So the state was very generous with almost everything. And characteristically, the army played a very important role, because soldiers were always borrowed as extras. The 300 Spartans, 300 Spartans were shot like that. So the framework, the large framework is appealing. Yet there is a decline in productions that come to Greece for different reasons. It's a totally different paper, why it's not working. It seems to be working at the beginning. There is a fascination with the country, with its people and so on. But then after a while, everything declines. But it has to do with other reasons. Marius Ploritis responds to this generosity towards the foreigners, which is not masked by an equal generosity towards the directors from Greece. And there are plenty of articles from directors who claim that it's impossible for them to do their work in Greece, while if you come from abroad, no matter how unsophisticated your project is, it will be met with unparalleled support. But this is the literal interpretation. Behind what Ploritis says is this growing anti-Americanism, which went hand in hand with the modernization of 1950s and 1960s Greece. And I think Ploritis is actually expressing this, the overwhelming presence of the American factor everywhere, but not making comments that are popularist. I think he's going straight to the heart of the problem by mentioning the fact that all these people are here because of certain reasons, and one of these reasons is that there are funds locked here. They have to be spent here. Don't fool yourselves. We are not doing something unique here. We're just being used for this situation. I'm not sure if I'm covering your question here. It's interesting to see what Ploritis writes in general at this time. He's a very acute commentator of the times. So on terms of methodological, the methodological issue, our interest in cinema, well, this is part of a larger research that was a while ago, and it had to do with how tourism began in the 50s and 60s after the war. And of course, looking at the GNTO archive was a rare opportunity for us to be able to see what as Angelos very well pointed out yesterday, the actual people that were designing the policies for tourism were thinking in terms of both architectural infrastructure, also festivities, and finally the promotion of the image of Greece. And cinema was very much seen as part of this promotion. It was seen as a cheap way of promoting the country. We only had to offer ourselves to the services of the foreign productions, and everything else was going to work finely. Bojan Adolfin is a a very interesting case study. That's why we focused on this, because it's the first large post-war production. And one of the few productions, I think yesterday you mentioned how easy it is to get to film and to shoot in Greece. It was always, people were invited to get to Greece to do their shoots. It was not always easy to get access to the major archaeological sites. So the huge problem was how to shoot on the Acropolis. Very few films managed to get access to shoot on the Acropolis. Boyan Adolphin is one of these films. The list is short. The archaeologists were the problem here, not the state. The state wanted more, the archaeologists wanted less. The archaeologists wanted to control the image of antiquity. They wanted to stage manage, as I said, how we perceive the antiquity. And it's interesting if you go to the Central Archaeological Council and look at the notes from the times and how they discussed which movies would be shot and where. The archaeologists went very much into detail on how the antiquities were to be introduced into the narrative. So they were issuing directional notes to the producers on how to frame the action, especially on the Acropolis, which is an interesting case because the archaeologists became the director through censorship. So we use this material, we look into films, we look into the spatial imprint of the GNTO policies and try to build an argument around three main factors. Modernity and modernization, which is always there, present. It's the main drive of the government. On the other hand, we have backward Greece, which is attractive, but also very problematic because it keeps gives us away from major investments in tourism and in the film industry. And the connecting factor, as I said before, is always the antiquities. The antiquities is the bridge between the picturesque but a bit underdeveloped Greece and the Greece of growth and development. So this is a very basic schematic representation of what we're trying to achieve through the film, but in our work in general. That was a long, sorry, it was another lecture. Sorry about that.
One last question. To what extent did the local authorities have an influence in the production of this movie, other than the archaeologists?
It varies. It varies. So, for example, with Skouras, I think Skouras had the upper hand on absolutely everything because he was Greek. He was seen as a friend. He was not treated as a suspicious foreigner who came to gain from the glories of ancient Greece. He was seen as a contributor to the effort of modernization. And there were pictures of him with members of the government discussing also the future of the film industry in Greece. Because it was also, the film was the vehicle. The aim was to create studios in Greece, which was never the case, of course. So that was, I think, the lure for the local community. Don't worry, now we have a film, but in 5 or 6 years, we'll have nice studios here. We can gain from that. So Skouras had carte blanche to do absolutely anything, but most of the productions found a strong hesitance from the archaeologists. I think that was the main problem in those productions that wanted to incorporate the antiquities into the narrative, had to find a way to deal with the Council of the Archaeologists, who were very strict, as I said before, in how the antiquities were portrayed. So, for example, if they would read in a scenario that a couple would hold hands inside an archaeological site, they would immediately cross that part of the scenario out. It's not necessary for people to show affection inside an archaeological site. Archaeological site is a temple. You go there as a pilgrim. You don't go there to feel, to come closer to your partner. So this is the kind of influence that the archaeologists could exert over cinematic productions. I'm not really aware of any other restrictions, but that's probably the strongest vehicle of control.
Thank you
You're
very
most
much.
welcome. Thanks.
Okay. Let us invite then Odysseus Garganas, the development and shaping of Greek national identity through tourism images and representations. He's going to talk about the case of the GNTO posters from 1945 until 1990. Thank you, Odysseus.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for including me in this conference. Thank you for including me in this conference. Thank you for hosting us. It's a great pleasure to join you. Today, I'm presenting you part of my research, which examines the development of post-war Greek national identity through tourism images, and found specifically in print posters as they were launched by the Greek National Tourism Organization. Πριν δούλευε νομίζω. In this slide, I summarize the identity of the research. You can take a look, even though I will elaborate on each one of them in the next few slides. So, today we're talking about tourism advertising, and particularly contemporary post-war tourism advertising. I make the distinction between pre-war and post-war tourism ads, and the reason is that there is a massive shift from pre-war tourism ads that looked more like editorial profiles of travel destination to post-war ads that looked like that were more sophisticated, drawing the desire of consumers for a more leisured way of life through mouth-watering images that intrigue the tourist wanderlust. Another reason that I make this distinction between pre-war and post-war tourism ads is that one of the research questions that I seek to answer seeks to identify if post-war Greek tourism ads become more sophisticated following the international trend of that time. Popular themes and concepts of contemporary tourism advertising is elitism, meaning traveling as a privilege and as a means of social advancement, the paradise quest as the daydreamer's pleasant scenery reflecting ideas of well-being, escapism associated to the quest for authenticity, the exotic, the extraordinary, the unknown, the unique, cultural folklore emphasizing specific aspects of the past, using national stereotypes that have been long recorded in the collective memory of people. And of course, advertising of national identity is one of the principal concepts and themes in tourism advertising communicated through the state narrative. Indeed, the idealization of nation branding through advertising drives a great part of the literature, especially in the last 30 years. In the roundtable yesterday, we talked about that. And nowadays, we are all aware of concepts such as nation branding and public diplomacy. But in our case, in this study, we are dealing with early destination, individual marketing and place branding efforts before the introduction of more integrated attempts such as nation branding. So we focus on tourism ads initiated by the Greek Tourism National Organization, which tries to enhance the country's image, Greece image, internationally from the 1930s and onwards. The striking issue here, when discussing the development of Greek national identity through tourism images, is that the promotion of national identity by a government-funded tourism organization is not simply a rational marketing act, a rational marketing activity, but can be an ideological concern and a political act motivated by dominant groups and reflecting the particular choices of local elites as they reimagine national identity. And as we will see later on, the results of the current study represent substantially the way a bureaucratic state organization like the GNTO presents the desired image of a nation in a symbolic way in a certain period. Method-wise, we employed content analysis as our research method, focusing on the GNTO print posters as the main communication tool to promote Greece. In particular, we chose the approach of Neudorf was chosen, which is a multi-step systematic process that requires the development of categories for coding thematic content, then training of specialized coders and statistical analysis of the results found in the advertising content. Our sample is a convenience sample comprised of 167 print posters based on the selection of all the available material of all readily available posters launched by the GNTO between 1947 and 1989 as the unique official source for this data. In our case, content analysis is employed in order to determine the presence, the frequency, and the distribution in time of the basic categories of national identity visual signs used to conceptualize post-war national identity of the Greek state. The different categories included in our coding scheme were drawn from the work of Dr. Zadidis on national identity signs found in commercial print ads of Cyprus over the period between 1960 and 2010, as they have been initially described in literature by Hogan and Ederson. This is part of the coding scheme, it's not the coding form. Other than that, just to see the categories, Dr. Zadidis talked about these categories in the round table yesterday. Other than that, the coding was made on the basis of both the primary, meaning the dominant visual signs, and the secondary ones. In other words, all national identity signs identified in the posters were coded. However, at this point, I need to highlight that this is an exploratory research effort which needs to be complemented in the future with an analytical approach to provide in-depth qualitative interpretation that examine both the manifest and latent meaning of advertisements. Now we focus on the manifest content. So the aim of the current research is to identify those national identity signs found in the images of the GNTO posters, focusing on the whole wide range of the national iconography. Based on the premise that the representations used in tourism advertising are not value-free expressions of identity for a place, the basic hypothesis is that tourism advertising contributes to the saving of the so-called imagined nationness. And we have then 3 research questions to support this hypothesis. First, which are the most popular categories of national identity visual signs and which are the dominant themes coded in the GNTO posters, and if these signs, if these categories formulate a certain direction of the post-war Greek state narrative. Second, how does the presence of these national identity signs change across time? And third, if the post-war Greek tourism advertising follows the example of international advertising compared to the pre-war pattern of site-specific ads. I did it. Okay. I just okay. Proceeding to the results. The coding of the 167 posters was broken down into 4 chronological clusters based on a division system per decade from the 40s to the 80s. The first 2 decades, 40s and 50s, were merged. This is because the first posters in the 40s were actually launched after 1947. So they were very few, and other than that, along with the posters launched in the 50s, they make up a more balanced distributed sample in terms of number of posters per decade that helps us to compare the national identity visual signs per decade and how they possibly change across time, answering the second research question. So in total, 303 national identity visual signs were coded in the posters, meaning almost 2 national identity signs were two national identity signs were coded in average per poster. In terms of the dominant national identity signs coded in our sample, it is profound that 2 categories of signs prevail during the whole period under consideration: cultural heritage and geography. Okay. Noteworthy is the total absence of signs like in the category of social relationships and values, while there is only a slight and insignificant presence of signs linked to leisure practices, national symbols, objects, food, drinks, with the exception of leisure practices in the 70s, but we will talk about that later. Cultural heritage signs dominating the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Oops, sorry. Okay. Occupying almost 70% of the posters, while in the 70s and 80s are represented in half of the posters. Cultural heritage derives its thematic content mainly from ancient Greek history, Orthodox tradition, and folklore tradition. Conversely, signs of geography are represented in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in 3 out of 10 posters, while in the 80s occupy here almost half of the posters, very close in numbers to cultural heritage. Popular Greek island landscapes comprise the great majority of visual signs in this category, geography, while images of traditional island architecture and the Greek coastline are also visual highlights that certify the intention to promote the naval character of Greece at the time. Similarly, the results do not change dramatically on the basis of a more inclusive sample, taking under consideration all national identity signs coded. Again, cultural heritage signs are found in half of the posters and signs of geography in 25% of them, with no great variations observed across time. Again, the presence of national identity signs of the rest of the category is minor, with one exception. The presence of national identity objects coded mainly as secondary elements in the background of a poster in our samples, such as the sailing boat, the boat, sunbeds, umbrellas, and traditional cafe furniture, among others. In order to further study how often, in what extent certain categories of national identity signs were visually portrayed, we came up with subcategories under the basic categories. So the most popular individual signs coded were island landscape, and beach under the geography category, the sailing boat under the category objects, and monument, temple, statue, theater, and Orthodox church under the category cultural heritage. Some interesting remarks at this point. We come up with a triptych island, beach, and sailing boat, which constitutes the condensed essence of the Greek geographic identity. And here you can see a visual matrix, some examples of the Greek island landscape in the GNTO posters. And here you can see posters of the Greek coastline. Food for thought is that the frequent presence of the sailing boat as part of the Greek island landscape, as a secondary element of the background of the posters, would be a great motive to examine this object as both a physical and a semiological construction of identity in the Greek state narrative. Now, under cultural heritage, as it was expected, the Parthenon comprises more than half of the signs under the subcategory monument temple, while also it's characteristic, the example of the image of the Greek ancient theater from the 50s and onwards, as a means to attract inbound tourists besides international ones. In that case, the viewing of heritage sites by domestic tourists is a key aspect in the formation and the maintenance of a national identity through nostalgia tourism and communal heritage, especially when nationalism is understood as an imagined community. Now, comparing the thematic content of the posters across time, this is only slightly differentiated in the 70s, and that's why I focus in this decade, with the introduction of the human element as it is depicted, represented in social relationships and values and leisure practices. Indeed, as you can see, in the 70s, the Greek island landscape is transformed into a field of action for couples, friends, and groups of people engaged in leisure activities such as hanging out, dining, swimming, etc., offering carefree and casually holiday images. However, this thematic shift was one-off since it didn't continue in the 80s. Probably the introduction of the human element, this shift of the thematic content in the 70s could be explained if we put it in the historical and social context of its decade. For example, the 40s, 50s, and 60s is a reconstruction period for Greece. For example, in the late 40s, the Greek state struggled to recover from the intense period of after the Second World War, while in the 50s and 60s, the recession coming after the Civil War and the dictatorship. So this slight thematic shift to more lifestyle concepts in the 70s, it might be associated with the rise of the Greek economy at that time, which affects the tourism industry as well. Heading to the conclusions, we come up with two main directions that the official state narrative of the Greek state adopts, and this direction would be defined as nationality through cultural heritage and nationality through landscape. Heritage and heritage tourism as part of cultural tourism is the buzzword, is a key word in our study, employed as a powerful force in the construction and maintenance of a national identity. The past as heritage, we have repeated these 2 days a lot of times until now. It can define a national identity through a few selected stereotypes of people, place, and mythologies. Even though Greek heritage provides an inexhaustible supply of material to support a distinctive sense of nationhood, still the state narrative, as it is depicted in the GNTO posters, adopts its own limited set of national symbols and sacred centers, emphasizing specific aspects of the past, which are appearing and reappearing continually within heritage tourism, and which are used not only to symbolize the nation and identity, but also consist a unique selling proposition in the international arena of competition. Such past is created through a closely held iconography of what it is to be Greek, and in our study, cultural heritage is represented by ancient Greek history, as I have already mentioned, the Orthodox tradition and the folklore tradition. The Parthenon, ancient antiquities, the ancient Greek theater, and the Orthodox Church are represented as the highest profile and the most influential sacred centers, and heritage works as the most common and authentic way that culture is represented to the rest of the world. And one closing remark with a paradox: even though the posters visually convey the aesthetic and the stylistic changes and the artistic trends of the creators of the time, their thematic content remain quite unsophisticated, in my point of view, as I see it, and quite static compared to corresponding post-war international campaigns promoting certain stereotypes in terms of tourist places and historical attractions. Thank you all.
Very great presentation, very systematic. Congratulations for the wonderful presentation. We can open the discussion to the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. This was really a beautiful presentation, and it begs a couple of questions for me. First is, are there posters nowadays?
No, there are no posters.
There are no posters now. So how are
maybe
these...
some collective ones, let's say. Yes, collective items, maybe some collective items. But no, systematically no. Systematically no.
This message is conveyed in other ways. And if we take maybe the images of Discover Greece or other more or less national sources of tourism promotion of Greece, I believe we would see a significant shift from this static perspective, Orthodox tradition and the antiquities, towards the exceptional Greek lifestyle, with social practices and people themselves being at the very center of what is placed before the eyes of potential travelers.
You mean nowadays? You mean nowadays?
Nowadays,
okay.
By all means. So there is definitely a shift both in a medium and in a content. So does this do something towards the construction of a nationhood? Nowadays is a topic for conversation, maybe not now, but in general. Thank you.
You think it's better? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's go.
Hi. Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you very much. I would like to ask a question. Is your research adding a little bit of stuff about the conditions of production of those posters? I am asking this question because I'm always very hesitant to ascribe specific big ideas, about ideological reflections on those posters or anything else, or grand state policies behind them, unless someone has in mind the conditions of their production. So some of those posters were like Karamanlis having a friend who was a painter and then telling him, go and make a poster. Some others have been independent bureaucratic decisions. Some others had been just the creative genius of a photographer. So because of this landscape, it's always kind of hard to say that these pictures reflect a state policy that you can see through time in a persistent way. So, and it's important, and it becomes more rich if you have a view about the condition of production. The way we do this when we discuss, for example, about the Xenia project, that the Xenia project is more understandable once you have the view about the agency and identities and all that stuff. Anyway.
Continuing at the same wavelength, from the perspective of the mass media perspective, most probably this was an excellent presentation. The real problem for all the rest of us stemming from the history field, for example, has to do, as Michalis noted eloquently before, from the way these posters were created. Personally, I would express an objection even in the way you have grouped them. You cannot group, for example, using as a common theme under the title social life or heritage, a poster of the 1940s or early 50s, and then a graphic design product of Kajourakis of 60s, and then a photo of the 70s or the 80s. I can understand the way you have considered about and to present, let's say, these similarities, but in my mind, this sort of presentation is rather obscuring than casting light to the real understanding of the, let's say, of the history of promotion and advertising in Greece. And to give you but an example, if somebody is not aware of the social milieu of the production of certain posters you have illustrated before, would not be able to understand that this blonde lady next to a Cretan guy you showed us under the title social life and values or something is a 1970, which is part of the dictatorship approach to show a more friendly, let's say, face of view of Greece in order to get to drag the country away from the international isolation it was at that time, and from all the criticism. And at the same time, so it has nothing to do really with the inclusion of values or social relations. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with any sort of market policies at that time. It has to do with certain political aspirations. While the same idea that comes the last 20 years, if one is to go through the posters, because there are posters nowadays stemming from the NPO, yes, we do have the presence of humans in everyday life practices, but this is on a market, from the marketing side, the way you have described it. We have to make these critical distinctions, because otherwise I feel if somebody is not aware, as I said, of the whole picture, might be, might formulate quite, let's say, mistaken concepts about what has happened in Greek tourism policy and Greek tourism promotion in the last 70 years.
Well, thank you very much. Just a brief to add to that very briefly, that I personally am a strong supporter and great fan of quantitative and qualitative analysis. I was wondering whether there are any tools that could incorporate except for the subject matter, graphic composition, framing, and of course the artists who were absent in this presentation, because I think that would make a greater, more contextualized analysis of what you very interestingly had shown us. And thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I would like to ask if, again, regarding the aesthetics, if there was a strategy in aesthetic terms, apart from the thematic part, and if there was how the artists or the photographers or the illustrators were selected, if there was a preference towards photography or towards painting or other means of production. So I would like if you could develop more a little bit the aesthetic aspect.
Mine is brief, so maybe the two, I don't know. I was just going to ask if you think the target of the campaign, of the particular campaign or poster, may be an interesting variable, because maybe an interesting variable, like the target of the specific poster, because in cases where this is targeted towards domestic audiences, they may be even more significant for national identity, maybe? I don't know. Thank you.
I think there's a difference because I've seen all of the newspapers. The posters do not appear on the newspaper's campaign. There is a difference here. Posters are for travel agencies. It's somewhere you go and you see it. There's a difference we have to make between posters and advertising campaign of the GNTO. And I think that's why the audience, there's not an audience per se. It's the image of the country. That's why I think ODCS can quantify it. There is a difference, the campaign that runs in newspapers and on TV. You don't see the posters at all. At least that's my experience. So we have to differentiate. So that's why he's right, saying this is a state-owned ability. That's one picture that it shows. Just, I think that's important.
These were creative collaborations. We could name them as creative collaborations. And I would like also to see, I really liked your presentation and I found it methodologically extremely sound. Okay. And that is something that I needed to see as a political analyst. So what I would like to see is really where the creators, which were the creators behind these campaigns? Okay, the artists, because these were creative campaigns, whereas today these are not posters, they are advertising campaigns, totally different things. So I would like to see who were these creators and whether there was also clear-cut strategy by the government, by the state, by the GNTO, whatever, in order to have this clear-cut creative collaboration. And who were these collaborators? Were they personal friends of Karamanlis, as well stated? Who were these people? Okay, that is an extremely interesting, I think, point to probably review or explore. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I was expecting that because this is a different perspective. So as someone said, this is a quantitative research. So there is a specific coding scheme that was selected that includes these thematic categories. This coding scheme is tested in other studies, so is accurate, is valid. And I follow that. Content analysis is systematic research method, has rules that we have to follow. And I cannot counter argue on if it is, the categories are clearly defined in the coding book that I made. So they are clearly defined by the literature. So I cannot deviate. I cannot deviate from that.
So good morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm Panagis Panagiotopoulos from the University of Athens, and with my close friend and historical colleague Vasilis Vamvakas from the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki, we are going to try to express ourselves and to present you something about iconic Greece, the post-war image of Greekness abroad. But I also want to thank Irini and Jelena for all their work and this great opportunity you gave us to try some new tools working on this Greek paradox always. So let's start. In this paper, we will highlight an historical periodization of Greek iconology constituted through three distinct but complementary levels of the global tourist and cultural imaginary. For this macroscopic approach to Greece and its cultural depictions, we use tools from cultural sociology, communication theory, social and political history. Special reference should be made to all those studies that in various ways have explored the symbolic dimensions of everyday and popular culture as sources of the construction of the national identities imaginary, axis of organization of a formal or informal national branding, ingredients of a banal but not aggressive nationalism, and some references points of a multiform exoticism. Our aim is to show that the symbols that compose the imaginary of Greekness are neither produced exclusively in Greece, nor by an external source. Our approach is both bottom-up and top-down. Each historical period is dominated by a strong pattern of familiarization of foreigners with iconic symbols of Greece. That is the result of a threefold encounter: the international economic, political, and cultural context, which largely defines the range of the dominant emotional and symbolic patterns of the global industry of tourism, the projections of the Western world about Greece, or what we call the various forms of Philhellenism, and third, the national self-image and its symbols as they are promoted in the global market. Studying foreign press about Greece as a pole of attraction, decoding state and commercial advertisements, and the international footprint of important personalities of entertainment and art, we came up with 3 time series. You can see them, 3 time series that correspond to 3 dominant cultural patterns of Greece as a destination of authenticity. In the first time series, in blue, we identify a lasting, prevailing, and with small internal changes, only small internal changes, cultural pattern of Greece that we will call Greece as authentic cultural heritage. This is the almost constant theme of cultural and historical Philhellenism, as it is gradually incorporated into the symbolic functions of global capitalism through tourism. It occupies a long time since the end of the Greek Civil War, but is now seriously declining during the 21st century. For the first time in the history of Greek tourism, this pattern is not dominating anymore. In the second time series, in red, a second cultural pattern develops that can be called political authenticity. This pattern is non-continuous, and while it is related to the first, especially regarding Greece as the birthplace of democracy, it has a strong autonomy. It is organized as political Philhellenism. Historically, it appears in a limited and non-commercial way within the Greek Civil War and its first aftermath, but it essentially rises during the dictatorship. However, it was largely interrupted by Greece's entry to the European Economic Community and the consolidation of the democratic regime in 1981. It will return at the beginning of the 21st century, so the image of Greece as the vanguard of global radicalism. The third and final time series, in yellow, organizes a pattern that correlates the Greek experience with the discovery of the authentic self. Here, Greece acquires a new dimension in which the cultural values of late modernity and especially the transformation of modern individualism are inscribed over time. Here, the tourist iconology of Greece passes through a lifestyle that is transformed according to global cultural developments, mainly through an open narrative that allows personal expression. This time series begin in the late 60s or the early 70s, despite of the regime of the political authoritarianism and the kernels in Greece. This pattern attaches to Greekness the individualistic ideal of an alternative self. It is the time when contemporary capitalism will meet with movements of dissent, which overcome conservative values and modern moral devotions to community sacrifice and ideological commitment, preferring the ethic of pleasure and personal fulfillment. Through those changes and transformation, this period extends up to nowadays, transcending for the first time the importance of the pattern of cultural authenticity. Let's see the three patterns in more details. The blue one. The historical cultural authenticity time series covers almost the entire historical period we are studying from the 50s onwards. Conventionally, we consider that it begins after the end of the Civil War. Its basic features can be traced in the travel and proto-tourism images of Greece much earlier. And without ever disappearing, it ceased to be dominant after the Olympic Games of 2004. It has a generic character and somehow appears as a stable infrastructure of the Greek imaginary. It focuses on the glorification of antiquity, but also on all versions of the Greek landscape, natural and artificial. Greece is an initiatory experience, a rite of passage, and a pilgrimage destination for the Western man. The iconology of Greece as place of cultural authenticity is consolidated during the Cold War. It is by no means signified as an urban experience. Greece appears as a dramatic country of dense emotions, which is being archetypically represented by iconic figures who embody modern skills and ancient qualities. And now, Bill.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. It's okay. So I keep on the pen here. Okay. In this context, it's not only the ancient monuments and statues that will illustrate Greekness in the. Look, we lost something? No.
Okay, is it better now?
Okay. We moved that maybe. It's not only the ancient monuments and statues that will illustrate Greekness in the tourist gaze, but also those faces and landscapes that indicate an earthly paradise of simplicity, naturalness, the Doric rhythm, as well as the attraction of the non-urban life. This pattern of historical cultural authenticity has to do with an idealization of the past, either concerning the ancient civilization or those cultural characteristics of Greekness that have remained intact over the years of industrial development. The Charioteer of Delphi and Anthony Quinn as Zorbas, the Caryatids and Irene Papas, the landscapes with antiquities and landscapes with the picturesqueness of the Greek sunny beach or the windmills of Mykonos, all of them come to speak of an indestructible Greekness, a founding element of humanistic Western values, but at the same time, a feature far from what the Frankfurt School could define as the instrumental reason of modernity. It is no coincidence that the popular film, Girls in the Sun, comes to speak through the conventions of romance about the exotic insistence of the Greek element on a primitive, basically masculine innocence that can hardly be reconciled with Western rationalism, despite the erotic attraction that exists between the Greek naive shepherd and the English sensitive tourist. Greece will be established as a country of history, as the place of the beginning of civilization. The opening and closing ceremonies of 2004 Olympic Games exemplified all these aspects of the Greek authentic heritage that is evolving. Although at the level of tourism promotion, this pattern recedes to a secondary position since the beginning of the 21st century, it is interesting that at the beginning of the pandemic period in 2020, and as tourist destinations were temporarily missed, the Greek National Tourism Organization is calling the image of Greece as an earthly paradise, but now in a liminal way as a state of mind. This means as an ideal realm of social distancing, which is being represented by deserted, almost utopian beach. The the second time series, the iconology of political philhellenism begins with a committed, however narrow, trend supporting the Greek hero of a world justice during the Civil War and its effects. The international coverage of the trial and execution of Nikos Belogiannis in 1952 and his figure itself acquired an emblematic dimension. Picasso's painting is characteristic. A new Greek hero is born then. However, this political iconology has no continuity and certainly does not create any significant tourist reference. Post-Civil War Greece itself is, for the iconological level, a frozen era, and in terms of tourist promotion, the pattern of cultural historical authenticity absolutely dominates. It is the advent of the dictatorship that re-enters significantly Greece in the map of the political philhellenism, makes the link to the starting point, the new Greek state's birth, and the fundamental philhellenism. Greece, through fictional and historical figures, now becomes not the place of birth, but of the violation of democracy. It is the point where the politicization of the destination comes to question the primacy of cultural authenticity that we analyzed in the first timeline. Kostas Gavras' film, Z, is an emblematic moment of the shift of international artistic interest in Greece as a political dystopia. It is interesting to trace the transformation of the symbolic significance of two famous Greek women who, before the dictatorship, were more or less identified in the field of film spectacle with connotations of Greekness as cultural authenticity. We are talking about Irini Papa and Melina Mercouri. Irini Papa at first functioned as a revival of ancient female statues, and as a performer of roles of ancient tragedy, became, for Hollywood and popular culture in general, the archetype of the beautiful classical Greek woman. Melina Mercouri, mainly through her roles in Gilles Dassin's films, embodied the erotic temperament of the Mediterranean woman and her unruly nature. Both will change roles remarkably with the outbreak of the junta. Irini Papa will play after in Zorba in 1964 in Z, moving from the role of the desired widow of Kazantzakis' fiction in the role of the politicized widow of Grigoris Labrakis. Within 5 years, she transforms from the embodiment of the pattern of cultural to that of political authenticity. Even more, Melina Mercouri, through her involvement in the anti-dictatorship struggle abroad, becomes the ambassador of the new Greece's demand for the return to good democracy. She should become Minister of Culture to masterfully combine at the same time both the two patterns of authentic Greekness, political and cultural, that's expressed in her life through the claim of the Parthenon marbles. The convergence of patterns of political and cultural authenticity, which begins in the late 60s with the political element as the second second dominant pole, becomes clear in the face of the great Greek composer Mikis Theodorakis as well, who not only becomes a reference point of political dictatorship music in Greece and internationally, but also a composer of a new authentic Greekness. It is no coincidence that we meet him in the two emblematic films of the two patterns as a composer. In Zorba, through Shitakis' dance, Theodorakis introduces a new Greek Dionysian dialect that will be spoken by almost all those who will visit really or imaginary Greece. Through Z, the song "To Gelasto Pedi," the smiling child, I think is the translation. Theodorakis will compose a romantic anthem for the everywhere defenders of democracy against junta regimes. The search for the authentic democratic self through Greece and its anti-dictatorship symbols will essentially last until the normalization of Greece politics and the full reconciliation of democracy with the rise of PASOK and the accession of Greece in the European community. Of course, it should be stressed that the pattern of Greece's political authenticity in the 70s is decisive in terms of its image abroad, but is doubtful whether this created a wave of foreign visitors to the country. The dictatorship is certainly not a point of posing tourism in Greece, but also not a reason of creating a trend of political radical tourism, as will happen much more recently. For a long period, the time series of political authenticity will almost disappear and reappear at the end of the first decade of the 21st century through a fresh political exoticism. Greece is upgraded to the radical imaginary and becomes part of the dialectical conflict of globalization versus anti-globalization. Through the symbolism of pop anarchism and the iconology of the destruction caused by the economic crisis, Greece becomes a platform for testing all forms of authentic politicization. The imaginary of a Euro-Mediterranean Cuba is here, and the exoticism of a paradoxical country will also take on tourist colors. The connection of the new radical philhellenism with the generic pattern of Asian heritage will be made through the coexistence of old and new ruins and the aesthetics of an urban crisis. The last act of Greekness as a realm of genuine the establishment and subversive politics will be hymn to the deterioration, since Greece will become the host country of immigration flows. And through this political semiology, it will be directed as a country that changes Europe and itself. Demonstrations, graffiti, activist actions in defense of immigrants, guided tours to the underground neighborhoods of Athens became tourist attractions in the decade of 2010 that have nothing to do with the idealization of Greece as an ancient metropolis of the Western spirit or a country of natural beauty. The attraction now to be advertised had to do with the fact that the Greek city is the mecca of alternative aesthetics and radical politics, not only for its residents, but also for its foreign visitors. The liquidation of Greek borders due to the influx of immigrants will make Greece a country without territory, a country of universal resistance to capitalism, racism, nationalism, and the conspiracies of the global elites. The third now time series follows the sociological and emotional developments of the capitalist economy since the end of the 60s. The pattern of individual authenticity epitomizes the autonomy of the individual from collective commitments, and in the specific case of Greece, it makes possible the disengagement from each connotation as a place of universal identity or political collectivity. In this aspect of Greek tourist iconology, we will see successively the development of various versions of modern individualism. Hippie tourism in Matala during the dictatorship in the late 60s, organized and unplanned nudism in the 70s, erotic tourism and the simultaneous kingdom of Greek lovers in 70s and 80s, organized Mediterranean clubs of middle-class liberalism. Today, passing from the banal middle-class holidays to the urban experience of a Greece that through consumer pluralism welcomes at any time of the year those looking for a unique personalized cultural experience. In this pattern, Greece serves the culture of individual expression and the search for authentic self, leaving largely behind in the very tradition of the authentic cultural heritage. In advertisement for tourism products, we already see that since the mid-60s, the first hesitant steps have been taken to disconnect the brand of Greece with the past. A cruise company already in 1965 says that Greece is the in place to go and accompanies the sexy photo of a girl in a bikini next to a fishing boat with the explanation from the starkly primitive to the graciously modern. In 1967, the New York Times advertised the ancient caves of southern Crete as an ideal destination for anti-consumer holidays. Since the 70s, the Greek National Tourism Organization has been producing posters that promote more tourist activities, even in the city, or reproducing the Greek landscape scenes from famous Hollywood films like From Here to Eternity. At the same time, appear more journalistic references, not so much with the issue of antiquity and the natural landscape, but with cultural everyday elements such as Greek food products. Ouzo, choriatiki, souvlaki, tzatziki, kalamarakia were initially mentioned in the international press and then, mainly in the decade of 2000, appeared in the advertising campaigns of the Greek National Tourism Organization to replace ancient monuments and sunny beaches. Here, tradition is not the general framework of understanding Greece as in the pattern of cultural authenticity, but one of the various options that the visitor should have and should taste. Postcards are also of particular interest in the post-dictatorship period, since they escape from trying to attract the tourist eye only through monumental or naturalistic logic and develop a clearly hedonistic invitation for either liberated or overtly sexual experiences. Interestingly, these soft porn postcards are likely to appeal more to Greek than foreign tourists as a sign of either a liberalization of domestic morals brought about by tourism or as a reassurance of traditional stereotypes of masculinity. In the 80s, we also see commercial advertisements that are mocking the ancient magnificence of Greece. A representative example is a hotel advertisement in 1987 stating Greece invented democracy, philosophy, drama, architecture, sculpture, poetry, medicine, bargains, and affordable hotels, clearly promoting the democratization of tourist luxury. In particular, the campaign Live Your Myth in Greece, over 1 year after the Olympic Games, comes in the most official way to state that the tourist is the protagonist of the visit to Greece and that the country is an ideal setting to create his or her own myth, her own search of a memorable experience. This campaign appeared at a time of a decline maybe of individualized and lifestyle tourism, but it comes to finalize the transition from the pattern of cultural authenticity to that of personalized one. So, to return to the attempt to map the phases of the iconic imagery about Greece as a place of authenticity, we would say that historical cultural authenticity dominates throughout the post-war period as the basic characteristic of Greekness that the visitor is invited to reach as a form of return to civilized roots, the roots of Western humanism and the romantic questioning of technocratic, commodified culture. There was a temporary retreat of this pattern for the sake of political authenticity, especially in the last years of the dictatorship and in the 70s. The same will happen in the decade of 2010, where radical political tourism this time will challenge the monopoly of cultural authenticity. At the end of the 60s, the pattern of individual authenticity is also gradually developing and will begin to dominate more and more until it will permanently displace the other two patterns. It is, let's go to the last. It is a partly interesting question in which cases and under what other circumstances the Greek element is perceived outside the frame of authenticity, attracting international interest. Without being able to enter a greater discussion of this issue now, we could see since the 90s many references of popular culture about the past and present of Greece that do not so much praise the historical, political, or lifestyle uniqueness, but rather integrate Greekness into a wider range of fluid, globalized symbols and images. Xena and Hercules, the popular TV series of the 90s, Big Fat Wedding, the international glamour of Adetokounmpo's character, the weird Greek films seem to readjust the Greek iconology to a completely new basis that either deconstructs the old myths of Greek authenticity or reframes them within the broader hybridization of all identities, including national identity. Thank you very much.
Lovely. So both of you mentioned the term of Hellenism, a movement that we closely usually associate with the 18th, 19th century, peaked in the Greek Revolution of the 1820s, but supposedly passed into decline after 1830. So do you see a sequence to that well into the 20th century? Because it seems to me like the first level of your authenticity seems like a legacy of this 19th century Hellenism. And quite tellingly, by the way, 19th century Hellenism is also, closely connected with another kinds of tourist experience, the so-called elitist grand tour. So it seems to me like a close connection between the two centuries. Will you comment on that?
A short one.
I have a question about. Yeah, okay. I have a question about the erotic photos that you put there. And you said that those posters were not that successful abroad. They were more like for the inner audience.
Could be.
Okay, so I'm just curious for like my research is like, how do you measure that? Is like your conclusion, or are there some references? Like, how can you measure like, what local audiences think about them and what like foreigners make out of it?
Postcards.
That's it.
Okay. Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. The issue of authenticity, how can we define it? It's quite a known term in order to discuss the tourism and the national branding, let's say, the term of authenticity. We use them, let's say, that as a synonym, the term of this kind of originality. The term of that Greece is a place to meet your origins. But this is not something unique, because all the countries say that somehow you have to find your origins in your country. The Greek case, as it is, the Greek iconology, as it is exported or constructed abroad, is that these origins are not the origins of the Greeks, it is the origins of the Western world, basically. Okay, so it is a return to the origins and the authenticity of the modern world, basically. This is the crazy thing in Greek authenticity.
If I can add something, when we, Vasilis and I, say authenticity, it's in a performative way. We don't believe there is something authentic somewhere and we can find it, and it's a way to approach a real empirical phenomenon. It's only something we can see in this approach of the cultural approach of a performative idea.
Maybe the thing that would be a valid criticism to what we are saying is that somehow we mixed up the two thematic categories that Odysseus displayed before, the cultural heritage and the natural landscape. We say that in the majority of the cases that we have searched, these two different thematic visual signs of Greece have the same, let's say, ideological pattern. Zorbas and the ancient statues are the same thing. They are not different things. And this is our point, let's say. We can discuss a lot about that, but this is my point. The other, I don't know, do you remember any other question?
The question of Christos about Philhellenism, Of course, it's a new philhellenism, and we are using it with this precaution. This is not the philhellenism of the 18th or 19th century, but there are roots there. And there are always a transformation of the old philhellenism into something new, a new form, maybe of the same thing.
The postcards, we have not done any reception studies on the postcards. It is an impression we have that, and a memory I have from using this kind of postcards, the Greek teenagers of that period, as let's say a meme. It's like a meme, you know, like nowadays. We could send this kind of postcards from islands in order to make fun of us as kamakia, as Greek lovers. So it was not, I don't know if it was a massive trend, but we did that. I know that some friends of mine did that for fun, not for... Thank you very much. I did not.
You did, of course. You just admit.
No, it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
No, it's your cause.
I think the others were commented. Zeta is a very important. I think we think it's something that it's going on during 60s, but the most emblematic moment is Zeta because it becomes a Greek and also an international reference of anti-totalitarian struggles, let's say. So I think it's a very important thing, and that's why we support that here is a change in the Greek iconology.
And it's the first time political movies are appearing in mass culture, and Greek left-wing politics are appearing in mass culture worldwide. It's the first time. It's
okay.
I think we are.
Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah,
Okay,
great.
okay,
Thank you very much. Let's invite now Poppy Sfaganagi, who's going to talk about Message de la Grèce, an illustrated magazine seeking to revive French tourists to Greece in 1946.
I continue. So more specifically, I will examine the visual and textual representations of Greece in it as a roadmap that Joannidis proposed for Greece's tourist promotion in France. Hercule Joannides was a Greek born in Asia Minor. He settled in Paris in 1926, where he had been hired as the director of the Paris office of the shipbroking company Neptos, owned by Leonidas Ebirikos. After the dissolution of Neptos in 1935, Joannides stayed on in Paris, where he founded the travel agency Voyage en Grèce. Joannides was a businessman, a publisher, a writer, and an art lover with a wide professional and personal network in both the maritime sector and the art world. The cultural cruises that he organized to Greece were far beyond business for him. First and foremost, he viewed them as the materialization of a mission to foster intellectual and cultural encounters between France and Greece, in the belief that contact with French intellectuals, artists, and other cultured tourists would contribute to the modernization of his homeland. He organized his first cruise in 1927 on the occasion and in support of the Delphic festivals. Another two were organized in the same year, a sports cruise that included mountaineering on Mount Olympus and a Byzantium-themed one that included a visit to Mount Athos. From 1929 onwards, Joannides usually organized 4 annual cruises to Greece. One was dedicated to classical Greece, another was a sports cruise, a third one was Byzantium themed, and the fourth one was addressed specifically to art school students. There was variety in the itineraries and specific themes of the cruises that took place each year, but all of them included on-board lectures by eminent professors and intellectuals. Even though Joannides was not the only one who organized cruises to Greece in those years, his were among the most prestigious ones, sponsored by important cultural institutions such as the Musées Nationaux, the École du Louvre, and le Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva, as well as by art and literature journals and newspapers such as Comédia, Beaux-Arts, Le Nouvel Littéraire, etc. Joannides' activity in the field of cultural tourism reflects a wider interest that the French cultivated upper class intellectuals and artists showed in traveling to and around Greece. This tendency, which was facilitated by the consolidation of tourism as an industry, was associated with the tradition of Philhellenism, as enhanced by the spatial cultural importance that Greece acquired for France in the interwar years. Prehistoric, archaic, and classical Greek art, as well as Greece's Mediterranean landscape, were sources of inspiration for modern and avant-garde artists in France, which promoted itself as the heir of ancient Greek culture and values. This claim allowed France to construct a Mediterranean cultural identity for itself at a time when it sought to assert its cultural supremacy over Germany on a south versus north axis. As there was also significant reaction among the French literate and artistic circles to fascist Italy's Mare Nostrum claims in the Mediterranean, Greece offered the best alternative as a source of cultural legitimization thanks to its ancient heritage. Joannides' illustrated magazine Le Voyage en Grèce aimed, according to the introductory editorial note, to, I quote, create a link between Greece and its travelers through contemporary writers, artists, and scholars, end of quote. The magazine promoted the cultural and natural heritage of Greece via representations produced by French and French-based avant-garde and writers and artists. More specifically, the magazine functioned as material evidence to cultural exchanges between France and Greece through the connection of ancient Greek art and the Greek landscape with French modern art and literature. The texts were accompanied by photographs by important photographers such as Fred Boissonnat, Elie Lothar, and Herbert List. Very few Greeks such as Trikoglu featured among them. From the very beginning, Joannides appointed his close friend Teriad as art director of the magazine. Teriad was an experienced art critic who was at that time art director of the art journal Minotaur. He had not only the knowledge, but also the necessary symbolic and relational capital to render Le Voyage en Grèce a successful amalgam of a tourist and an art magazine. Aware of the power of images to inform views and perceptions and their impact on readers, Teriad gave a privileged position to photographs. Each issue featured 30 to 40 photographs of ethnological or archaeological interest, or of the bucolic Mediterranean landscape of Greece. Giannidis' vision was to project the image and the idea of an ecumenical Greece through the pen and art of contemporary writers and artists. The cruises would then transform these media narratives into real geographies. Giannidis viewed ancient Greek civilization as the cultural heritage of the whole of Europe. But in fact, his main concern was, as already noted, Greece's cultural uplift and modernization. The Second World War brought Giannidis' business activities to an abrupt end. After the end of the war, there was an effort in France to put tourism back on track. As Nicholas Manitakis has convincingly argued, the common experience of the war renewed the relationship between France and Greece on both sides. Giannidis' attempt to relaunch the cruises and the magazine was encouraged by and relied on this new wave of Philhellenism and Francophilia. Even though he had in his hands an unpublished issue almost ready from before the war, he chose to produce an entirely new one, aspiring to entice cultured French tourists back to Greece. So a special issue of the magazine was published in 1946. It was entitled Message de la Grèce and promoted not only the Greece of myth and dream, but also that of liberty. The main question of the editorial note written by Ioannidis in the form of an opinion poll was, I quote, "At the moment when the world has just escaped the threat of an unprecedented tyranny, we need to ask ourselves whether the new freedom we want to enjoy can be traced back to antecedents in the history of Greece and whether the examples of liberation that Greece has set for the world are still valid," end of quote. Texts by important representatives of the French intelligentsia like André Gide, Paul Valéry, Pierre Reverdy, praised Greek heroism and resistance. They included excerpts from the ancient Greek literature and evoked stories from Greek mythology, especially with reference to Prometheus, Oedipus, Dionysus, Apollo, and Pallas Athena, but also from the Greek War of Independence and the Greeks' resistance to fascism and Nazism during World War II. They represented Greece as a symbol of liberty, stressing either the debt that the Western people, and especially the French as heirs of the Greeks, had to Greece, or the identification, empathy, and brotherhood they felt towards the Greeks, since the French and the Greek people had in common similar experiences of war, German invasion and occupation, resistance, and liberation. It is noteworthy, but not surprising, that the issue did not contain any mention of the turbulent political circumstances that led to the Greek Civil War, which started in 1946, or to the Mataroa artists and intellectuals. By making this issue a tribute to Greece's love of liberty and independence, heroism, and courage during the Second World War, Giannidis chose to continue to promote an ideal image of Greece, enriching his pre-war palette with new values that appealed to his French readership, such as anti-fascism and the fight for freedom. As Sophie Bash remarks, I quote, "The more they try to understand Greece, the less they will be able to use it." End of quote. Apparently, Giannidis thought that the magazine's silence about the unpleasant reality of a politically torn and violence-ridden country would facilitate French identification with and appropriation of Greece within the context of promotion of tourism. The illustration of the special issue reflected the texts and continued the magazine's pre-war line of associating ancient Greek art with French modernism. The front cover was designed by Henri Laurence. It depicted the Greek goddess Pallas Athena as a symbol of courage, bravery, and heroism in war. This selection was probably due to Thériard, who had collaborated with Laurence for the illustration of ancient Greek literature. The simplicity of color and the primitive character of the drawing allude to the decoration of ancient Greek vases, creating an implicit association with ancient Greece. The back cover depicts the Greek flag, on which Laurence added a lying female figure that may symbolize Greece and its wartime sufferings. It is to be noted that all the pre-war issues feature a medal depicting Xenios Zeus on the back cover. The medal was the logo of Neptos company and an allusion to Greek hospitality. In the special issue of 1946, the medal was relegated to the inner side of the back cover. The pages of the magazine featured a selection of recent creations by the great masters of French modernism, such as Matisse, Picasso, Masson, and Léger, There is no information as to who selected these particular artists and illustrations, but it is possible that it was Thériard who, as a publisher from 1933 onwards, was collaborating with all of them. The illustrations reflected qualities such as simplicity, geometry, balance, a sense of measure and expressiveness that were thought to be the legacy of ancient Greek art. More specifically, the artist's works in the issue were in dialogue with details from ancient Greek vases, further reinforcing the idea of continuity between the Greek and French arts. Apart from the linkage, it is to be stressed that after the war, modern art, with Picasso as the emblematic figure, was promoted as the art of resistance and regained freedom, which were principal themes of the special issue, as I have explained. It is also to be noted that 1946 marked the formal recognition of modern artists by the French state with the opening of the Museum of Modern Art. The museum exhibited works by all the artists who contributed to Message de la Grèce, and Jean Cassou, another contributor to the issue, as its director. Even though the pre-war issues of the magazine featured many photographs of Greek landscapes, especially insular ones, the special issue of 1946 included the reproductions of only 4 landscape photographs. They were all taken by Boissonat and published in the interwar issues of Le Voyage en Grèce and depicted Naxos, Crete, Ithaca, and Xunio. They illustrated the poem Méditerranée by Joseph Billet, a text by Édouard Churet on the Greek soul hidden in the ancient Greek temples, and a text by Michel Héris in which he argued that Greece's freedom is due to the Greek geography that contains intelligence. Finally, despite the many references to the war, the only photographic evidence of the trials and tribulations, as well as of the heroism of the Greek people, is a collage of many small size photographs that highlighted Greece's resistance to the Axis powers, and a photo of the Great Famine in Athens under foreign rule in 1941 that accompanied the chronicle of German occupation and resistance to it by Pierre Amondry. Giannidis preferred to highlight Greek heroism and contribution to freedom through Greek mythology and works of art by ancient Greek and modern artists. This decision was in line with the magazine's pre-war policy of projecting a timeless, utopic, and picturesque image of Greece, with which Giannidis thought that any cultured French and other European could readily associate. Finally, the special issue contains few references to journeying around Greece. It begins with a letter by a student from Sorbonne's ancient theater group addressed to one of his classmates who had died during the war. The inspiration for the text comes from Greek mythology, but the author also recalls their participation in the cruise of 1937 and their strong emotions while visiting ancient Greek theaters. Albert Camus contributed a text that referred to how the war prevented his journey to Greece, attributing symbolic value not only to the journey, but also to the obstacles to it. Finally, the dramatist Georges Neveu started his text by expressing his enthusiasm that Giannidis had relaunched Le Voyage en Grèce and that his cruises were to resume, and ended it with wishing him luck. However, Giannidis' hopes of relaunching the cruises and the magazine were not likely to be realized anytime soon, as the civil war in Greece paralyzed tourism, which recovered only after 1950. It is no coincidence that the first updated edition of Guide Bleu after 1935 was that of 1953. That same year, a second guidebook to Greece was published in France by Éditions Audet, following the line of Le Voyage en Grèce. As Christine Peltre has shown, the guidebook was less of a travel guide packed with practical information than an interpretation of the country through images and literary texts by renowned writers and illustrators. In fact, most of its contributors had previously contributed to Le Voyage en Grèce. The illustration of the book consisted of color photos and drawings by the illustrator Eddy Legrand. Although both text and images drew on elements of everyday life, they maintained the tradition of presenting a timeless and idealized Greece. As for Giannidis, he soon lost hope of relaunching his tourist activities and eventually committed suicide in 1950. To conclude, Giannidis obviously was not the only person active in promoting Greece as a tourist destination in the interwar and the early post-war years, nor was he the only one who projected an idyllic, idealized image of the country with a strong emphasis on Greek antiquity and the sunny Mediterranean landscape. What made him stand out was his elitist vision of tourism as a platform of cultural exchanges, as evidenced by his cruises and magazine. He was not interested in mass tourism, but in what he viewed as tourism with a mission, namely to modernize and civilize his country through contact with the cultured elite of a major Western European nation. The special issue of Le Voyage en Grèce that he published after the Second World War reveals that he had not changed his pre-war philosophy of addressing an elite public that would be beneficial for Greece to visit it, and of advertising the country through the writings and artworks of modernist writers and artists based in France. As a good businessman and patriot, he highlighted the topical issues of resistance to Nazism and struggle for freedom, but overall did not desist from projecting antiquity and its legacy of universal humanistic values as the main asset of modern Greece. The publication of the special issue did not have the desired outcome for Giannidis as the precursor to the revival of his business activities. However, it is one of the earliest post-war cases of textual and pictorial representation of the journey to Greece. It was a joint effort coordinated by a Greek, but carried out through the contributions of numerous French and French-based intellectuals and artists. In this respect, it can be treated as indicative of the combined uses and effects of Philhellenism and Francophilia, as well as of the attitudes and expectations of the elite circle that sought to promote cultural relations and exchanges between France and Greece in the post-World War. Thank you.
Fascinating presentation, very interested in, well, because as you will see later, I work with magazine. And I just wanted to clarify something, if you could, and then you can tell us how do you contextualize that, not in terms of tourism, but also its production time. And so I wanted to clarify, this is a special issue 946, but there are a lot of issues that are all about Greece. This, not sure.
Of Le Voyage en Grèce? Yes, they are. That's a special issue because it brings liberty as its theme in it.
Right, okay.
Yes.
That's really interesting because there's a continuation of what we were talking about earlier in the 60s, this Greece and authenticity with Z. So I'm wondering if there's a parallelism there of using resistance and what was more fashionable than electric resistance in 1946 in Europe. As a business stroke, do I dare say, for promotion of the magazine? Is that what you're sketching out?
Yes, it's for the elites at that time, and that's why I told you that he uses also Picasso, who is a symbol of the resistance at that moment. And many of the writers, many of the contributors are left-wing, or they have already expressed their ideas on anti-fascism. So yes, it is a way of selling it, of course.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, you have the big long list of contributors, and the one name that really jumps out, especially because, as you say, the anti-fascist stance was Pierre de la Rochelle.
Yes.
Of course, the fascist is fascist.
Yes.
France. And I wondered about that sort of that era of politics, and if it's something that changes from the interwar to the post-war, or is it just part of art, not politics, or
there is all there. Yeah, that's true, and there are some writers like Pierre de la Rochelle, speak French, who write about Greece, and he incorporates some of them. What we have his personal diaries, So in his personal diaries, his ideas are completely anti-fascist, as for Ioannidis. But I think that in terms, of creating the magazine, he incorporates only a few names of those that write on Greece and publish on Greece, like him. But it's an exception. It's among the exceptions, but you're right.
Any other questions?
Let's go for it.
We're running late, so let's discussion in the break. We can go now.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes, I'm afraid. Is that okay? 10 minutes, we'll be back, and thank you so much for your